My name is Winnie, and at 52 years old, I thought I understood what love looked like. When I married David 3 years ago, I believed I'd found a man who honored his past while embracing our future. Every Sunday at exactly 2 o'clock, he'd drive to Riverside Memorial Cemetery with white roses to visit his first wife, Sarah's grave. I admired his devotion, seeing it as proof of his capacity for deep love. For 2 years, I never questioned this ritual. I trusted completely. But trust, I learned, can be the most dangerous emotion when placed in the wrong hands. What I discovered beneath those Sunday visits shattered not just my marriage, but everything I believed about the man I'd vowed to love forever. Before I share what changed my life completely, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever had that nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right in your relationship, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe because what I'm about to tell you might just save you from the same heartbreak I endured. Now let me take you back to where this all began. The autumn leaves were just starting to turn golden when I first met David at the downtown public library in October 2019. I was researching lesson plans for my 8th grade history class when this gentle-eyed man approached my table asking if I minded sharing the electrical outlet. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly disheveled, and when he smiled, tiny lines crinkled around his eyes in the most endearing way. We ended up talking for 3 hours about everything from local politics to our favorite books. David was transparent about his past from that very first conversation. He told me about Sarah, his wife of 22 years, who had lost her battle with breast cancer just 18 months earlier. The way his voice softened when he spoke her name convinced me I was meeting a man capable of profound love. He shared how difficult it had been raising their daughter Emma, who was 16 at the time, while watching the love of his life slowly slip away. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet sadness that made my heart ache for both of them. As a mechanical engineer for the city's water department, David was practical and methodical, but when he spoke about his family, warmth flooded his features. Our courtship unfolded slowly and beautifully. David never tried to hide his grief or pretend Sarah hadn't existed. Instead, he invited me into his world, carefully making sure I understood that his past was part of who he was. We'd take long walks through Riverside Park, where he'd tell me stories about his life with Sarah, their dreams, their struggles with her illness. I found his openness refreshing after years of dating men who treated their past relationships like classified information. By Christmas 2019, I knew I was falling in love with this man who wore his heart on his sleeve. Our wedding in April 2020 was small and intimate, held in my backyard with just a handful of friends and family. Emma, now 18 and preparing for college, served as David's best woman. She seemed genuinely happy for us, hugging me tightly after the ceremony and whispering, "Thank you for making Dad smile again." Those early months of marriage felt like a beautiful dream. David would surprise me with coffee in bed, leave little notes in my lunch bag, and hold my hand during our evening walks. As a middle school teacher, I appreciated his patient, steady nature. He never rushed me or made me feel like I was competing with Sarah's memory. When he started visiting Sarah's grave every Sunday, I saw it as beautiful evidence of his loyalty. Riverside Memorial Cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the river, peaceful and well-maintained, with ancient oak trees providing gentle shade over the headstones. David would leave our house at exactly 1:30 each Sunday afternoon, stopping at Fletcher's flower shop to buy a bouquet of white roses, Sarah's favorite. He'd return home precisely at 4 o'clock, usually quiet and reflective for the rest of the evening. I never questioned this routine because it seemed natural, even admirable. Here was a man who understood commitment, who wouldn't simply forget the woman who had shaped 22 years of his life. But somewhere around our 8-month anniversary, subtle changes began creeping into our peaceful routine. The first thing I noticed was David's restlessness on Sunday evenings. After returning from the cemetery, he'd pace around the house, checking his phone repeatedly and starting conversations he never quite finished. Sleep became elusive for him on Sunday nights. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning to find his side of the bed empty, discovering him downstairs staring out the kitchen window or scrolling through his phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I'd ask if everything was okay, he'd force a smile and say he was just thinking about work projects. The phone call started in November, always after 11 at night, always when David thought I was asleep. The first few times he'd slip out of bed to take them in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones about what he claimed were emergency work situations. But his voice carried a different quality during these conversations, softer somehow, almost intimate. When I mentioned the late-night calls, David would dismiss them as boring municipal emergencies, nothing worth discussing. Emma's behavior changed too. Her weekly phone calls to David became shorter and less frequent. When she did call, their conversations felt strained, lacking the easy warmth they'd always shared. During our Thanksgiving dinner, Emma seemed distant polite, but guarded as if she was keeping something important to herself. I attributed it to normal college adjustment stress, but the nagging feeling that something was off kept growing stronger. In December, I started noticing financial irregularities. David had always been meticulous about our shared expenses, but suddenly there were flower shop receipts for amounts that seemed excessive for a single bouquet. When I casually mentioned it, asking if he was buying extra flowers for other graves, David's explanation came too quickly and sounded rehearsed. He claimed the florist had started charging more for premium roses, but I'd driven past Fletcher's many times and seen their pricing signs unchanged. The night that really shook my confidence happened just before Christmas. David had fallen asleep on the couch watching television, and his phone kept buzzing with text messages. When I gently shook his shoulder to wake him, his phone was face up on his chest, and I couldn't help but see a message from an unknown number that read, "Meeting as usual Sunday," followed by a heart emoji. My stomach dropped, but I convinced myself it had an innocent explanation. The next morning, I asked David about it as casually as possible. He explained that an old friend of Sarah's occasionally joined him at the cemetery, someone who missed her too. His explanation made sense, but something about his body language, the way he avoided direct eye contact, planted the first real seeds of doubt in my mind. That same week, I noticed David had started showering immediately after returning from his Sunday visits. Previously, he'd come home, and we'd spend the evening together, but now he'd disappear into the bathroom for lengthy showers, emerging in fresh clothes with his hair damp and combed. When I jokingly asked if cemetery dirt was particularly stubborn, he laughed it off, saying he just felt better cleaning up after being outdoors. But I'd started noticing a faint perfume scent on his clothes when he returned something floral, but definitely not roses. The smell was subtle, but distinct. Nothing like any fragrance I owned or had ever smelled in our house. The first Sunday in January 2021 marked the beginning of my transformation from trusting wife to amateur detective. I told David I needed to run errands and would be out most of the afternoon, but instead of going shopping, I drove to a parking spot about 2 blocks from Riverside Memorial Cemetery. My hands shook as I pulled out the small binoculars I'd bought the day before, telling the sales clerk I was getting into bird watching. The cemetery stretched across rolling hills, and from my vantage point, I could see the section where Sarah was buried. At exactly 2:15, I spotted David's silver Honda pulling through the cemetery gates. My heart hammered against my ribs as I adjusted the binoculars and followed his car's path through the winding roads. What I saw next felt like a physical blow to my chest. David wasn't alone. A woman with the shoulder-length auburn hair was already standing beside Sarah's grave when David approached. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, wearing a navy blue coat and brown boots. When David reached her, they embraced not the casual hug of acquaintances, but the long, lingering embrace of intimate partners. I watched in stunned silence as they held each other for what felt like eternity, her head resting on his shoulder, his arms wrapped protectively around her back. They moved together with the easy familiarity of a couple arranging the flowers together, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. After about 30 minutes, they walked hand in hand to a bench beneath a large maple tree, where they sat talking, his arm around her shoulders, her hand resting on his knee. The perfume smell I detected on David's clothes suddenly made perfect sense. This woman, whoever she was the source of that foreign fragrance that had been clinging to my husband's shirts for months. The following Sunday, I returned to my surveillance post praying I'd somehow misinterpreted what I'd witnessed. But there they were again, same routine, same intimate body language. This time, I managed to get a clear view of the woman's license plate as she left the cemetery 15 minutes before David. Armed with this information, I spent the next week doing research that would have impressed any private investigator. The license plate belonged to Linda Morrison, age 44, registered address on Maple Street, about 3 miles from our house. A quick search of social media revealed that Linda worked as a registered nurse at St. Mary's Hospital downtown. Her Facebook profile showed photos of her with 2 young children, a boy and a girl, and her relationship status was listed as divorced. But it was the older photos that made my blood run cold. Buried in her timeline from 3 years ago were pictures of Linda with a group of women at what appeared to be a high school reunion. One of the women in those photos was unmistakably Sarah David's first wife. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity, but I needed to know more. I spent hours scrolling through Linda's social media history, discovering that she and Sarah had been close friends since their teenage years. Even more disturbing were photos from 2017 and early 2018, showing Linda in what appeared to be hospital settings, wearing scrubs and smiling beside patients. The timeline suggested Linda had been working in oncology during the period when Sarah was battling cancer. Had Linda been Sarah's nurse? The thought made my stomach churn with implications I didn't want to acknowledge. My hands trembled as I dialed Linda's number on a Tuesday afternoon in late January, having found her contact information through the hospital's online directory. When she answered with the cheerful "St. Mary's Oncology Unit, this is Linda," I nearly hung up. Instead, I forced myself to speak. "Hi, Linda. This might sound strange, but I think we have a mutual friend, David Peterson. I believe you knew his wife, Sarah." The silence that followed lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Linda's voice returned, cautious and much quieter. "Yes, I knew Sarah. She was a wonderful woman. May I ask who's calling?" When I identified myself as David's current wife, the gasp on the other end of the line was audible. His wife. But David told me he would never marry again after Sarah. He said he couldn't imagine loving anyone else. Those words hit me like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the trust I'd built my marriage on. Linda's shock seemed genuine, and in that moment I realized she might be as much a victim of David's deception as I was. We agreed to meet the following day at a small coffee shop downtown, both of us needing answers that apparently only the other could provide. Linda arrived 10 minutes early, and I recognized her immediately from my surveillance and her social media photos. Up close, she was prettier than I'd expected, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. We sat in a corner booth where she explained her relationship with Sarah and David in a voice heavy with emotion. Linda had indeed been Sarah's primary oncology nurse during the final 8 months of her battle with cancer. She and Sarah had developed a close friendship that extended beyond the hospital, with Linda often staying after her shifts to provide emotional support to both Sarah and David during the most difficult periods. Sarah knew David and I had feelings for each other. Linda confessed, tears streaming down her face. She actually encouraged it toward the end. She made me promise to take care of David after she was gone, to not let him suffer alone. According to Linda, she and David had begun a romantic relationship about 6 months after Sarah's death, meeting secretly because David felt guilty about moving on so quickly. They had been planning a future together when David suddenly announced he'd met someone else and was getting married. Linda thought I was just a rebound relationship that would end quickly, but when months passed and David remained married to me, she'd confronted him. David had convinced her that his marriage to me was temporary, a way to provide stability while Emma finished high school and transitioned to college. He'd promised Linda that once Emma was settled in her adult life, he would divorce me and they would be together openly. He said Emma wasn't ready to see him with someone who had cared for her mother, Linda explained through her tears. He said you were just a placeholder until the timing was right for us. The coffee in my cup grew cold as Linda revealed detail after devastating detail. David had been living a double life for over 2 years, maintaining our marriage while promising Linda a future together. She showed me text messages going back months where David declared his love for her, made plans for their future, and repeatedly assured her that his marriage to me was temporary and meaningless. The most shocking revelation came when Linda placed her hand on her stomach and whispered, "I'm 12 weeks pregnant, Winnie. David is the father." The pregnancy announcement felt like the floor disappearing beneath my feet. Linda was carrying my husband's child, while I had been playing the role of unknowing wife in David's elaborate deception. As the magnitude of his betrayal sank in, Linda continued sharing details that painted an even more disturbing picture of the man I'd married. "David's been preparing for our future together," she said, pulling out her phone to show me photos of a beautifully furnished downtown apartment. "He signed a lease 6 months ago and has been gradually moving furniture in. There's already a nursery set up for the baby." The apartment was elegant and spacious, clearly expensive, decorated with care and attention to detail. In the nursery photos, I could see a mahogany crib matching changing table and shelves lined with children's books. This wasn't the hasty arrangement of a man having an affair. This was the methodical planning of someone building a secret second life. When I asked how David was affording such an expensive place on his city engineer salary, Linda's expression grew uncomfortable. He said he had savings from Sarah's life insurance policy, plus some investments that had matured. He's been very generous covering all my medical expenses, and even giving me money to reduce my work hours during the pregnancy. A cold realization washed over me as I remembered our joint savings account and the investments David managed. That evening, I rushed to our computer and accessed our financial records, discovering a devastating pattern of unauthorized transactions. Over the past 8 months, David had systematically withdrawn money from our joint accounts, forging my signature on investment liquidations, and even taking cash advances on credit cards I didn't know existed. More than $50,000 was missing, representing virtually every penny I had contributed to our marriage, including the proceeds from selling my small condo when I moved in with David. The paper trail was extensive and damning. David had been funding his second life with Linda, using money he'd stolen from our shared assets. Bank statements showed monthly transfers to pay Linda's apartment rent deposits that coincided with her medical appointments and large cash withdrawals that now made perfect sense. He had even purchased a life insurance policy with Linda as the beneficiary, something I discovered when a confirmation letter accidentally arrived in our mailbox addressed to David. The next morning, while David was at work, I drove to the downtown apartment complex Linda had shown me in the photos. Using the address she'd provided, I was able to confirm the lease information with a chatty property manager who assumed I was David's sister checking on the apartment for family reasons. The lease was indeed in David's name, with a co-signer listed as Linda Morrison. The monthly rent was $2,800 more than we were paying for our house mortgage. That afternoon, I called Emma at college, hoping she might provide some clarity about her father's behavior. What she told me completed the puzzle in the most heartbreaking way possible. "I've known about Linda since before you and Dad got married," Emma admitted, after I pressed her for honesty. "Dad told me he was marrying you to provide stability while I finished school, but that Linda was his real future. He made me promise not to tell you because he said it would hurt you unnecessarily when the relationship was always meant to be temporary." Emma's confession shattered any remaining illusions I had about my marriage, but it also crystallized my determination to fight back. David hadn't just betrayed me. He'd involved his daughter in an elaborate scheme to defraud me emotionally and financially while positioning me as a temporary inconvenience in his grand plan with Linda. The next morning, I made an appointment with Patricia Williams, a divorce attorney whose reputation for protecting women's rights was legendary in our city. Patricia was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who had heard similar tales too many times. After reviewing the financial evidence I'd gathered, she assured me that David's actions constituted multiple forms of fraud that could result in both civil and criminal penalties. Your husband has committed forgery, embezzlement, and fraud, Patricia explained, spreading the bank statements across her conference table. In this state, those crimes can result in significant jail time, especially given the amounts involved. But more importantly, for your immediate situation, they give us tremendous leverage in divorce proceedings. We developed a comprehensive strategy that would expose David's deceptions while protecting my financial interests and emotional well-being. Patricia's first step was hiring a forensic accountant to trace every dollar David had stolen from our joint assets. The investigation revealed the full scope of his financial manipulation, including credit cards opened in my name without my knowledge and investment accounts he'd emptied by forging my signature. The total theft exceeded $75,000 when including interest and penalties on accounts he'd overdrawn. While the financial investigation proceeded, I worked with Patricia to gather evidence of David's emotional fraud. We documented his systematic lying about the nature of our marriage, his secret relationship with Linda, and his manipulation of Emma in the deception. Patricia explained that in our state, I could seek compensation for emotional distress caused by fraudulent inducement to marry, especially given the evidence that David had never intended our marriage to be permanent. The most challenging part of building our case was confronting Emma about her role in David's deception. I arranged to meet her during her spring break, determined to help her understand how her father's actions had harmed not just me, but her own moral development. Emma was initially defensive, arguing that she'd been trying to protect me from unnecessary pain since the marriage was always going to end anyway. But as I walked her through the evidence of her father's financial crimes and the depth of his manipulation, I could see her beginning to understand the true nature of what he'd done. "I thought Dad was just being practical," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "He told me you'd be better off not knowing the truth until it was time for you to move on. He said he was being kind by not hurting you with information about Linda." I helped Emma understand that kindness never involves deception, theft, or fraud, and that her father's actions had robbed me of the ability to make informed choices about my own life. By the end of our conversation, Emma agreed to provide a written statement detailing everything David had told her about the temporary nature of our marriage and his long-term plans with Linda. Armed with comprehensive evidence of David's crimes and betrayal, Patricia and I prepared to file for divorce with demands for full restitution compensation for emotional distress and criminal prosecution for his financial crimes. But before we set legal proceedings in motion, I decided David deserved one opportunity to face the truth of what he'd done and perhaps salvage some shred of decency by voluntarily making things right. The confrontation with David took place on a Sunday evening after he returned from another visit to Linda at the cemetery. I had arranged all the evidence on our dining room table like a prosecutor preparing for trial, bank statements and photographs and legal documents, creating an undeniable mosaic of his betrayal. When David walked into the room and saw the display, the color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might collapse. For several long moments, he simply stared at the evidence in silence, while I watched him realize that his carefully constructed lies were finally crumbling. "Winnie, I can explain all of this," he began, but I cut him off with a voice steadier than I felt. I had rehearsed this moment with Patricia, and I was determined to maintain control of the conversation. "David, I know about Linda's pregnancy. I know about the apartment you've been renting with my stolen money. I know about the life insurance policy with her as beneficiary. I know that Emma has been aware of your plan to divorce me from the beginning. I know everything." His face cycled through emotions: shock, fear, anger, and finally a cold calculation that showed me a side of David I'd never seen before. Instead of remorse or apologies, he launched into justifications that revealed the depth of his selfishness. According to David, he had convinced himself that our marriage was beneficial for me because I'd been lonely before meeting him. He argued that Linda needed him more because she was raising 2 children alone, and had been Sarah's closest friend. Most disturbingly, he claimed that taking money from our joint accounts wasn't really theft because he'd always planned to compensate me financially when our marriage ended. "You would have been fine," he insisted, as if my emotional devastation and financial ruin were acceptable collateral damage in his pursuit of happiness with Linda. "I was going to make sure you were taken care of when Linda and I got married. You were never supposed to find out this way." The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours, during which David revealed the full scope of his manipulation and self-serving justifications. He had convinced himself that everyone would be happier once his deception was complete, that a few years of fraud and betrayal were acceptable prices for achieving his desired future with Linda. He expressed no genuine remorse for the emotional trauma he'd caused me or the illegal activities he'd committed to fund his secret life. When I informed him that I'd already filed for divorce and reported his financial crimes to both the district attorney and his employer, David's facade finally cracked. The gentle, loving man I'd married disappeared, completely replaced by someone desperate and cruel who blamed me for destroying everything by refusing to accept my role as a temporary wife. He threatened to fight the divorce proceedings and claimed that Linda's pregnancy proved she needed him more than I ever had. That conversation was the last time David and I spoke as husband and wife. The next morning, Patricia served him with divorce papers and a restraining order that prohibited him from accessing any of our shared financial accounts or attempting to contact me outside of legal proceedings. The legal battle that followed was swift and decisive, largely because David's crimes were so well documented that he had little choice but to accept our terms rather than face prosecution. The divorce was finalized 6 months later with terms that exceeded even Patricia's expectations. David was required to pay me $85,000 in restitution, representing the money he'd stolen, plus interest and penalties for the emotional distress his fraud had caused. He also had to transfer his share of our house to me, completely leaving me with a mortgage-free home and enough money to rebuild my financial security. Perhaps more satisfying than the financial victory was watching David face the consequences of his actions in other areas of his life. His employer, the city engineering department, terminated him immediately upon learning of his criminal activity, and his professional engineering license was suspended pending a full ethics investigation. Linda's pregnancy had complications that required her to take extended medical leave from the hospital, leaving David struggling to support her and her 2 children on unemployment benefits while paying massive restitution to me. The elegant downtown apartment he'd rented for their future together had to be abandoned when he could no longer afford the rent. Emma eventually reached out to apologize for her role in David's deception, and through several difficult but honest conversations, we were able to rebuild a relationship based on truth rather than manipulation. She was horrified to learn about the financial crimes her father had committed and the depth of emotional abuse he'd inflicted through his systematic lying. Emma now understood that her father's actions had taught her that deception was acceptable when pursuing desired outcomes, a lesson that had already begun affecting her own relationships in unhealthy ways. The process of healing from David's betrayal was neither quick nor easy. For months after our divorce, I struggled with feelings of humiliation and self-doubt, wondering how I could have been so thoroughly deceived by someone I trusted completely. I joined a support group for women who had experienced financial fraud by intimate partners, discovering that David's methods were disturbingly common and that my experience of feeling foolish for trusting was shared by many intelligent, capable women. Through therapy and the support of new friends who understood my experience, I gradually learned to distinguish between healthy trust and naive blindness. I discovered that David had been particularly skilled at manipulation, using my own values of loyalty and commitment against me by presenting his Sunday cemetery visits as evidence of those same values. The red flags I'd ignored weren't obvious warning signs, but subtle inconsistencies that only became clear in retrospect. Today, I own my home outright and have rebuilt my savings to levels higher than before I met David. More importantly, I've learned to trust my instincts and ask difficult questions when something feels wrong, rather than convincing myself that love requires blind faith. I've returned to teaching full-time and have found deep satisfaction in mentoring young women about the importance of financial independence and critical thinking in relationships. The experience taught me that genuine love never requires secrecy, theft, or deception to flourish. True partnership involves shared decision-making, complete honesty, and mutual respect for each other's autonomy and dignity. David's willingness to steal from me and lie to me for years proved that what I thought was love was actually just his convenience disguised as devotion. Every Sunday now, I spend time doing things that bring me joy and peace, reading in my garden, visiting with friends, or exploring new places that catch my interest. I've never felt more free or more confident in my ability to recognize authentic love when it appears in my life again. The woman who blindly trusted David's cemetery visits was someone who believed that questioning love meant destroying it. But the woman I am today understands that real love grows stronger when built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. If you've ever felt that nagging doubt about someone's behavior in your relationship, trust those instincts and don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was living a secret life? Share your story in the comments below, because your experience might help someone else recognize the warning signs. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming betrayal and finding strength. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve complete honesty in their relationships. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most painful discoveries lead us to the most beautiful new beginnings. Stay strong. Trust yourself and never settle for anything less than the whole truth.